to end. Thank you. Hey, welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Mike Bell, Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy here at the National World War II Museum. It's great to see everybody this evening. Thanks for coming out, and thank you very much. Now, before we begin, there are some important recognitions for those here in person and at home. I would ask any World War II veterans, home front workers, or Holocaust survivors, would you please acknowledge yourself? And if they're not here, though, let's just go ahead and commemorate them and give them a round of applause. And then any veterans or active duty members of our armed forces from any era, would you stand and be recognized or wave, please? Thank you very much. Thanks for your service. And I would ask, though, sometimes the toughest job in the Army are the spouses and the family members. So any family members of active duty or veterans, would you also stand and be acknowledged and recognized as well? Family members? You can. Come on, so good. Thank you. As it is, it takes a large family to make all that possible. I'd also like to recognize our Patriot Circle and Charter members here tonight. Your support allows us to bring wonderful programs to you and those watching at home. A shout out to the Purdy's. Great to see you here. I know, a point out there, the Freedom Theater has recently won a major award. Those who haven't seen that yet, same award that Beyond All Boundaries won years ago. So congratulations, well done on that achievement. Now tonight's opportunity is part of our annual Faith in Wartime lecture series, which we've hosted here since 2014. This was started to provide additional educational opportunities that would coincide with the Liberation Pavilion, which, as opened in November 2023. Now, a few topics that we've covered over the years: the Immortal Four Chaplains of the SS Dorchester, Catholic efforts to rescue Jewish neighbors, the Chaplaincy Corps, the Chaplains of D-Day, and Buddhism and Japanese American incarceration camps, among others. This series would not have been possible without the support and commitment of Baptist Community Ministries. And BCM is committed to improving the physical, the mental, and the spiritual health of people and communities of the 5-parish Greater New Orleans area. So thank you to the Baptist Community Ministries for this, for all that you've done for this museum, but importantly for our community. And so please join me in a round of applause for BCM. Now, some of you may know, one of our former chairs of our Board of Trustees, Herschel Abbott, also served on the board of BCM and was really instrumental in bringing our two organizations together as part of this initiative. Now, tonight we're excited to have Dr. Debórah Dwork with us. She'll speak about her most recent book titled Saints and Liars, the story of Americans who saved refugees from the Nazis. Dr. Dwork is the director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She is known as a leading authority on university education of Holocaust studies, changing the academic landscape to create doctoral training in this important subject. She's the author of multiple books on Holocaust history, including Holocaust, a History, Auschwitz, and Flight from the Reich. Dr. Dwork is a recipient of many awards, including the 2024 Distinguished Achievement Award from the Holocaust Educational Foundation, and she was the 2020 recipient of the International Network of Genocide Scholars Lifetime Achievement Award. Interviewing Dr. Dwork this evening is a member of our own faculty, Dr. Sean Scanlon. He's a talented historian here at the Jenny Craig Institute. Now, Sean is a Massachusetts native, received his doctorate from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. His research focuses on American foreign policy, so this is an amazing aspect of that policy. Before joining the museum team last year, Sean was a visiting professor at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts and at the University of Mississippi. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Sean Scanlon and Dr. Debórah Dwork.
All right. Can everybody hear us okay? Brilliant.
The real question is, can you hear me? Well, then it's all right then.
Well, Debórah, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I want to get us started with a fairly basic and broad question, which is I'd love it if you could just tell us about Saints and Liars. What is the story that you're trying to tell, and what made you want to tell us about relief workers and rescuers in particular?
That is a huge question, Sean. So let me, if it's okay, I feel the need to announce that I am honored to be here, that I have used this museum's website for years and have enjoyed its accuracy and its breadth and depth. And so, of course, I was incredibly honored to be invited to come to speak with you this evening. So I thank you for the honor that your institution has shown my work. So, thank you. So what is the story I wanted to tell? Let me tell you a story about the story I wanted to tell. Years ago, I was researching my first book on the history of the Holocaust. It's called Children with a Star, A History of Jewish Youth in Nazi-Occupied Europe. Working on that, I went into the Quaker archives to learn about Jewish child life in areas where the Quakers were busy and active. And there I was working through the archives, and I came across a photograph of a Quaker operative holding a Jewish child in her arms in an internment camp in France. And I looked at this woman and I said, I looked at the photograph, I looked at the child, I looked at the adult woman, and I said to myself, who are you? What are you doing there? How did you get there? But being a historian, of course, I put it to the side. We never work on things that are immediate. We always have to let things get a bit old before we turn to them. And so there, that question sat. Until finally, 20 years later, I thought to myself, it's time to find out who you are. So that's the story that I want to tell about the story that I want to tell, which is, there's another piece to this. I'm like the radio. You can just tell me to change the channel if you get bored. But anyway, another piece of this that I think is really important is that a number of survivors whose histories I recorded or whose histories I have heard knew that some American operative helped them get to safety, find refuge. But they had no idea who that person might be. So in two ways, I came to the question of who are you?
So, could you tell us a little bit about who these rescuers are? Because across the chapters, you talk about some different groups. Could you tell us a little bit about who exactly these rescuers are? Men, women, Christian, Jewish? So you sort of lay the land of who these people are, what some of the different organizations that are doing this work are.
So the people that I worked on were Quaker operatives. The Quakers had the American Friends Service Committee, and which had been founded at the end of World War I, in 1917, in fact. And so they were already operating in Europe. And as I mentioned to you, it was in the Quaker archive that I found that photograph that prompted my quest, ultimately and eventually. So Quakers were active in Europe with relief activities. There's a distinction between relief and rescue. Relief is the provision of food, help with finding shelter, clothing, shoes, provision of medical care, relief of needs. Rescue, you understand, is something else. Rescue, in the end, turned out to be refugee work, moving people through the system and sometimes outside the system to help them get to places of safety or relative safety. So I worked on Quaker operatives, Unitarian operatives, and Jewish operatives. As I think I mentioned to you, Sean, I wanted to work on Catholic operatives, but I couldn't find a single one, which isn't to say that Catholics were not involved in relief and rescue, but they were Europeans. And American Catholics were sometimes very generous in supporting financially the work of their co-religionists on the ground in Europe. But American Catholics were not operatives in the same way as the Quakers, the Unitarians, and the Jews were.
So another really interesting aspect of the story is that I think when we're thinking about maybe diplomats, there's a tendency to think about this as a very male story, but the characters, or the subjects in your story, in your chapters, are not just men. Could you talk a little bit about some of the women in your story?
Absolutely. Social work. Even in 1938, 1939, 1940, social work was accepted as women's work. But this social work, going abroad, leaving the United States, offered the women previously unimagined opportunities for self-fulfillment, but also for adventure. As one of the women, Laura Margolis, who worked for the joint distribution, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, so she's a Jewish operative. As Laura Margolis said, if I'd been a man, I would have joined the Navy. But as I was a woman, I joined the JDC. So the women did incredible things, always undervalued by their home offices. So Laura Margolis got a salary because she was not married to anyone. So she got her own salary. But these other women, Unitarian, Quaker women, about whom I write, if they were part of a couple, They were not paid at all. The husband's salary was to cover both, and yet the home offices expected them to be full partners in the relief and rescue work.
So, since this lecture series is based around faith in wartime, I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about the motivations of these rescuers. And we've established who they are, what some of their backgrounds are. But I'll just put this to you very, very plainly. What is the role of faith in sort of generating their motivations to do their work? What's the role of faith in motivating them to become rescuers and relief workers?
One couple that I talk about, Martha and Wade Still Sharp. They were Unitarians, and they were the first couple they were the first social workers that the Unitarians sent to Europe to provide help. Martha had been trained as a social worker. Wade Still was a minister. So he already had faith, and he felt that his work in Europe, they were sent to Czechoslovakia, he felt that his work was a manifestation of his faith. He was living his principles. Martha, as I just said, she was not a minister. There were no women ministers, Unitarian ministers at the time. She was a social worker. By the time they went to Europe, she was a mother and therefore not working outside the home, as was customary at that time. She doesn't talk about faith at all. Wade Still does, Martha doesn't. Laura Margolis, the Jewish woman I just mentioned to you, the one who would have joined the Navy, she talks about her work as part of her Jewish identity. She works within the Jewish community. It's not about her relationship with God. It's about her relationship with other human beings, Jewish and non-Jewish. So I would say that there's a whole range of motivations. The woman whose photograph I saw, Marjorie McClelland. Marjorie was married to Ross. Marjorie was Quaker. Ross was not born into a Quaker family, but came to be part of that community, especially with his marriage to Marjorie. And both of them felt, in a way like Wade Still did, that their work as operatives on the ground in Europe, providing relief and then morphing into rescuers, was an expression of their faith.
So one of the things you talk about in your introduction has to do with the roles of the unpredictable and the irrational. Could you talk a little bit about how these ideas sort of shaped the actions of these rescuers in the story that you're trying to tell? Like, obviously, we talk about culture and race and other sort of macro factors in history, but you really zero in on the unpredictable and the irrational. You talk about luck, timing, chance, fortuitous circumstances, human sympathies and antipathies, drives and desires. Would you talk a little bit about the unpredictable and the irrational?
So historians typically talk about age, social class, occupation, religion, gender, but they know what to do with those factors. But we, and I include myself in this, we know somewhere we know that luck, that the irrational and the unpredictable, luck, chance, fortuitous circumstance, irrational, sympathy, antipathy, passion. We know that these shape our own lives, and yet when we look at the past, we ignore it. We elide those factors. We don't train our lens to try to figure out, how does this work? So for years, people who had been involved with the Holocaust, either as victims, as survivors, as rescuers, told their histories, their life stories to me, recorded their oral histories. And they talked about luck. By luck, this or that happened. And yet, it was as if I was deaf to it. As I say, I didn't know what to do with it. And I didn't even think about the fact that I didn't know what to do with it. I just put it to the side. So as you now know, historians put things to the side for 20 years, and then they say, hey, I better think about this. Let me tell you about, I'm going to tell you a story. And it's not about an American. It's about a Jewish girl named Hannah Starkman. Hannah, her mother, and her brother Heniek were living in the forcibly created ghetto of Radom in Poland. Heniek was at labor, and Hannah and their mother were in their room. I can't say in their apartment because everybody was stuffed into rooms. You're following me so far? So it was late at night, and all of a sudden everyone in the building heard the boots on the stairs, boom, 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 and the screaming and the shouting, house, 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 everybody out, everybody out, everybody out. And so Hannah and her mother went out into the street, and they went one way, and then after a certain period of time, they were allowed back into their room. Everybody was allowed back into the apartment building. They had no idea why they had been pulled out, and then they learned. Radom had two ghettos, the small ghetto and the large ghetto. The small ghetto was liquidated that night, and everyone in the small ghetto was put onto cattle cars and sent to Treblinka, where they were murdered. There was some space left over, like a wagon and a half. And so the Germans didn't want to waste the space, and therefore were pulling people from the large ghetto to fill the deportation train. As it turned out, everyone who went into the street and turned one way was not plucked by the Germans. But those who, totally accidentally, by happenstance, exited the apartment building and went the other way were scooped up and sent to Treblinka that night. So Heniek and the neighbor's son worked in the same place. And when the two young men came back to the apartment building that evening, late in the night, that other young man did not find his mother or sister because they had been captured and sent to Treblinka. But Heniek found Hannah and their mother because they had gone the other way. And Hannah, telling me this story, said, it was just the luck of the draw. It was one of those things. It took me 20 years to pay attention to what she was saying. And then as soon as it clicked into focus, I began to explore how luck, chance, the role of the unpredictable and of the irrational. I have one more thing to say about the irrational. How many of you here have ever formed a relationship with a partner? So, a number of you. Did you have a checklist? Why'd you like the woman? Because I liked her. Why'd you like the man? I liked him. We can see how powerful the irrational is in our own lives. But we don't analyze it. So this book, Saints and Liars, does a deep dive, explores the role of the unpredictable and the irrational in historical events, which doesn't negate policy, practice, ideology. Were it not for ideology, policy, and practice, Hannah and her mother and Henyek and the neighbor family, if it weren't for the Germans' ideology and policy and practice, they wouldn't have been in that situation at all. But in that very moment, luck, fortuitous circumstance came into play.
Thank you for that. So across your chapters, you tell a lot of really fascinating stories. And one of the things that emerges to me really, really powerfully is that each of the different cases that you dive into, all the relief workers and the rescuers face all kinds of different challenges. And I have a bunch of thoughts here about the ones I'd like to talk about. But I wonder what do you see as some of the most important challenges that rescuers faced as they're trying to go about doing their work?
Gosh, where even to start? As one of the rescuers said at the time, well, of course it was hard. If it were easy, they wouldn't have needed us to be there. So what are some of the difficulties? There are practical difficulties, and then there are emotional difficulties. Practical difficulties, funding. First, it was legal to send money from the United States to Europe. And this continued even after Europe went to war because we were not yet in the war. But when we entered the war, other regulations kicked in, and it was no longer possible to send funds to enemy-occupied areas. Not only was it not possible to send funds, it was in principle forbidden to have communication. So Americans like Laura Margolis, who was in Shanghai at this point under Japanese rule, she was forbidden to communicate with the JDC in New York because she was in enemy territory. So, practical. back to practical. Finances. Always a difficulty, in time of war, even more so. Another practical difficulty, communication. If you can't communicate with your home office, how can you be sure that your decisions will be accepted? Laura Margolis needed to raise money. So she finally decided that, you know what? I'm just going to decide that the JDC will pay back anyone from whom I get a loan. So she said she had no authority to issue these loans, but if she didn't issue these to take on the loan, but had she not done so, she would have had no money to offer relief for the 13,000 Jews under her care. So she said, I figured the JDC would make good on my promises. And if they would fire me, okay, so I'll lose my job. But if I don't try this, many will lose their lives. So, money, communication. Then, on the 1st of July, 1941, the Close Relatives Clause went into effect, which held that we, the United States, would not admit anyone who had a close relative in Nazi Europe, anywhere in Nazi Europe, or in Soviet territory, or in Italian territory. Now you tell me, who's left? What social democrat, communist, because those were the people who were at risk, Jew, who of these groups didn't have some close relative in enemy territory? So regulations, our regulations were a problem. Then there are these receiver countries, Spain, Portugal, and their regulations changed at whim. So sometimes the rescuer thought that she had all the people organized, all the details nailed down, that she had the paperwork she needed, exit visas, transit visas, entry visas, ship tickets, railway tickets, only to find that one category of paper was no longer valid because the regulations had changed. So constantly changing regulations were a problem. Mm-hmm. And then I just want to spend a minute talking about the emotional, which is that letters were still permitted, although they were heavily censored. And communication became attenuated between the operatives and their home offices, or cut off entirely, as happened with Laura Margolis. But as these communications got attenuated, tempers frayed. It opened the possibility of quarrels. And oh my goodness, everybody quarreled. They quarreled and they quarreled and they quarreled. If I didn't call this book Saints and Liars, I would have called it The Quarrelers.
So you actually raise a really interesting point, which is that while we might sort of think that even though we're talking about different denominations, Unitarians, Quakers, different faiths, Christians, Jews, in some ways they share the same objectives. But one thing that emerges really powerfully from your book is that there are often these fierce disagreements between groups, both between these Christian denominations, but also between Christian groups and groups like the Joint. Could you talk a little bit about the tensions sort of within faiths and between faiths?
Sure. So, denominational rivalry certainly played a role. The Unitarians were late to this, as I say. And one of the reasons why they engaged was because of was out of principle. But one reason was also denominational rivalry. As the Home Office people said in Boston, the Quakers, well, he turned it the other way around. The Unitarians are a body as large as the Quakers. We are as wealthy a body as the Quakers. But the Quakers get all this credit because they have this American Friends Service Committee. What's wrong with us? So denominational rivalry was certainly an issue in the establishment of aid systems, but it also played out on the ground. As I mentioned, one of the reasons that rescuers did the work they did was because of the excitement and the self-fulfillment. Well, if you've got a project going, or the promise of a project going, and it seems very exciting, then the last thing you want is for those Quakers to come along and share the glory. So there was also that. Within the Jewish community, there were segments that championed the ultra-Orthodox. There were segments that championed the labor Zionists. And if you think about it, there were millions of people to be saved. Whom are you going to help? How do you make the decision about whom to help? And that question also gave rise to rivalries and quarrels. Also, I wanted to say about quarrels. It occurs to me that maybe quarrelsome people go off to have adventures, or maybe the opposite. Maybe placid people stay home.
So that's really interesting. Could you talk a little bit about on this question of kind of who is worthy of assistance? I think that's another really, really interesting detail that you get into. I'm thinking in particular of Marjorie McClelland and your chapter on her. Could you talk a little bit about the debates, the specific debates about which groups were prioritized over others and why different groups argued for saving, say, intellectuals versus children versus political refugees? Could you talk a little bit about how different groups kind of made those calls, those very difficult calls?
The Unitarians had certain specific principles. They never considered themselves a major organization. Their goal was to save people, to try to save people who would be of use in reestablishing democratic regimes after the war. So even before we got into the war, the Unitarians were making plans for the day after. And they wanted to save the politicians, the statesmen, the artists, the leaders of society, the culture bearers. Think about it. Nearly all male, nearly all well-educated, nearly all upper middle class. Life on the ground had its own dynamic. And so when the Unitarians could help someone else, they didn't hesitate to do so. But their principle, the principle under which they acted, was to have these specific categories. The Quakers, by contrast, were equal opportunity. They absolutely eschewed making distinctions. They wanted to help whoever needed help, period, full stop. But again, life on the ground was different. So you mentioned Marjorie McClelland, whom I love. I have to tell you, as I mentioned to you, she's the person whose photo I saw. I love Marjorie McClelland. But it's also true that she was responsible for choosing 50 children to go on a transport to the United States. And this all did happen. So she went for a tour through children's colonies in the south of France, in unoccupied, in Vichy, France. She wrote little biographies of each child, and her predilections and her prejudices course through these biographies. She favored the pretty ones, the flexible ones, the ones who didn't make a big fuss or bother, the ones who seemed to have a good or sweet disposition. And those are the people she chose. And those are the people who were saved.
Yeah, this is such a complicated and I think at times very uncomfortable issue, but a really fascinating one. Something else that jumped out at me, and I think here might be another opportunity to compare groups like the Quakers and the Joint, is this idea of is a relief group or a rescue group going to sort of work within the existing legal structures of the country they're operating in, or are they going to try and break the law in pursuit of providing assistance and rescue? Could you talk a little bit about how different rescuers dealt with the question of whether or not to obey the law?
So the Unitarians were perfectly willing to bend the law, break the law. The Quakers were punctiliously law-abiding. And this meant, and I should also say the Joint was equally law-abiding. The Joint was law-abiding on principle. They felt that they would be accepted they would be allowed to stay to continue to do their work if they acted strictly within local law and regulations. And they'd had a lot of experience, and they found that it worked for them. The Quakers did so not so much out of practical consideration, but because of principle, that they were law-abiding. The Unitarians broke the law also on principle. And not only that, but another manifestation of it was that the Quakers joined the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, because they were dealing with people on the run, with refugees. And those people on the run, those refugees, were a source of wonder, a wealth of information about life in occupied areas. So they, the refugees, reported this to the Unitarian operatives, and the Unitarian operatives reported to their handlers. You follow that? So they were perfectly happy to do clandestine activities. That was their thing. And they made a good case for it. Think about it. They were well placed to gain information.
So another really interesting, and I think at times very troubling aspect of the story you're telling has to do with the sort of expectation of success. Like, there are a couple of points where I think some of the operatives you talk about have to make a decision about, like, what are we going to push for? Are we going to try and get these refugees out to safety, or are we going to try and do what we can for them because the escape route is just closed off and actual rescue becomes impossible? So could you talk a little bit about the sort of back and forth between the desire to provide relief versus rescue? I'm thinking here in particular of Laura Margolis in Shanghai, when at a certain point, the opportunity for getting refugees out is just closed off. And that at that point, she says, well, if they're not going to get out, the least we can do is to provide some element of relief for these people in these very dire circumstances.
Yes. So everyone else who I've talked about, and others whom I hope you will discover if you read Saints and Liars, they started out offering relief. They were relief workers, and their work morphed into rescue. When it was clear that relief was not going to provide the long-term solution, the sole long-term solution was seeking asylum elsewhere, helping refugees. Then it morphed to rescue. Laura Margolis, by contrast, was sent by the JDC at the request of the State Department. She was sent to Shanghai, and her job was to unblock. There were some 20,000 refugees in Shanghai at that time, and it fell to Laura Margolis to unblock the logjam and help them get out of Shanghai to the United States, to South American countries, to Cuba, and so on. But then, after we entered the war, that was no longer possible. So the refugees who were already in Shanghai were fated then to stay in Shanghai until the war was over, and Laura Margolis assumed she was too. So she and they were in a city of millions of people under Japanese control. So she could not, her work morphed or arced in the opposite direction, not from relief to rescue, but from rescue to relief. So how was she thought to herself, how am I going to deal with this? there are 20,000 refugees, 13,000 are already under our care. They need food, they need lodging, they need medical care. How am I going to do this? And that was the beginning of her journey to figure out a way to keep that community alive, which she did.
So Debórah, I want to ask one more question before we open it up to the audience, which is that how did the figures that you profile in your book sort of look back on their experiences? Were they proud of their experiences, or were they disappointed that they didn't achieve more? What did their sort of wartime experiences look like to them in retrospect?
That's a really interesting question. Marjorie McClelland certainly felt that and spoke about how she wished they'd been able to save more people, to help more. But most of my Americans, who are now also your Americans, did not speak about their reflection on that.
Mm-hmm. They were silent on it, or they just didn't write down their thoughts?
We don't know.
All right. Well, I think that's a great opportunity for us to open it up to questions from the audience. So we've got a couple of folks with microphones around. Connie's coming over there.
I hate to open a can of worms, but when you're trying to move that many people under that kind of duress, it seemed kind of logical that the lady would have to pick the more cooperative children, or those that seem to look like they'd be more cooperative, just because you have to move that many at one time, and probably under a lot of secrecy.
So there was no secrecy on this particular convoy. It was the 50 children who were chosen. They got sign-off from everybody. And you are right. It could be that one of the reasons why she prized the adaptable ones was precisely because they would give her little trouble. There we are, right smack with the irrational. I mean, it may be rational to think at least this child isn't going to make a big fuss. But the larger issue is, do I really want that factor to be the determining factor in whether this child gets a spot?
Next question will be towards the back.
I have several. Do you have any guess on how many were actually rescued? And where were they sent? Were they sent to England, or were they sent to the U.S.?
Well, I can give you one figure. The Unitarians reckon that Martha helped 3,500 people, applications, but one application could be for a family. But what we don't know is how many of them, of that 3,500, how many of them actually were successful in getting out of Prague, and from there, how many survived the whole war. So what we have is that basic figure that Martha brought 3,500 dossiers to a successful conclusion, meaning she got them to the next step. but we don't know what happened thereafter.
And in your research, by any chance, did you discover that some of the people within the group were sympathetic to the Nazis?
None.
We'll stay in the back.
Thank you. Can you explain the title of the book to me? I understand the saints, but I don't know about the liars.
The Quakers didn't lie much. But the Unitarians, they were happy to lie. And Laura Margolis, she was happy to lie. So they became liars in their pursuit of rescue. Is it clear now?
Okay, we're coming back towards the front.
In making the selections, did they split families, or how did they do that?
Yes, they did. Yes, they did split families because of the regulations. So children under the age of 14, first it was under the age of 17, then it was children under the age of 14. So siblings who were eligible were kept together. But if they had a sibling who was older and fell out of the regulations, then that child was not chosen.
Okay, and we'll be over to your left.
I just had, as an Irish Catholic, I was wondering the reasoning from your side why the American Catholics weren't involved in this. You mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. Do you have an opinion on why there were no American Catholics that went to Europe?
I have been told, but I have no expertise in this area, that it has to do with the structure of the church. That there was, that because Catholicism works on a parish level, the idea was to enable the local parish hierarchy to do this work rather than having an American come over.
We have time for one last question, and we will be over in the back.
My question is, who were the Americans that saved these children? And why wasn't the Jewish community involved in this?
The Jewish community was involved.
And to what extent?
So there are many different initiatives going on at the same time. In that, if you are speaking about the convoy with the 50 children that Marjorie McClelland chose, is that what you're referring to? I can't hear you, I'm sorry. Wait, here comes.
Were there any particular Americans like the Rockefellers, just giving a name out, or very, very important people at that particular time? And the Jewish community, I was wondering why hadn't the Jewish gone full blown with this, except just for the Quakers and the Unitarians? That's
Oh
all.
no, the joint, the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, was totally involved. Laura Margolis was an employee of the joint, and then another person whom I didn't mention at all yet, Moses Beckelman, was also, he was operating in Vilna, in Kaunas and Vilna, but most particularly in Vilna. And then, sir, you wanted figures. Moses Beckelman probably helped 3,000 refugees out of Lithuania to Japan, to Kobe, and also to Shanghai. the JDC was going full bore.
And the JDC is deeply involved, is all over the world, not just in Shanghai, but in Europe. They're even involved in getting aid into the Warsaw Ghetto at different points. The JDC, the Joint, is an utterly fascinating organization.
So I'm sorry if the way that this went did not give you a window onto what the Jewish community was doing, but I offer you the opportunity to read Saints and Liars and learn.
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Drs. Debórah Dwork and Sean Scanlon.
And because I have to have the last word, I applaud each and every one of you.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Dwork for being at the National World War II Museum tonight with us to share her work. She talked about a number of different perspectives to include chance, luck, and irrationality, but you have a rational opportunity to get a copy of her book. She'll be signing copies here in front of the Higgins boat right afterwards for those that would like that. Thanks to Sean for running an intriguing conversation. And I think we could have the questions continue, but thank you, Sean.
My pleasure.
I'll say he passed, right? He passed. I'd like to invite everybody, if you care to join us across the street at Kilroy's in the Higgins Hotel for continued conversations with Debórah and Sean. Kilroy's will be offering an extended happy hour till 9 p.m. Central Time. So, and then for the future, please mark your calendars for the next Jenny Craig Institute program, Fighting for the Right to Fight, African American Experiences in World War II, our symposium, which will be held in conjunction with the current special exhibition on display over in the Hall of Democracy. This will be presented by the Lois and Lloyd Haskins Foundation. The Fighting for the Right Symposium will take place on a Saturday, 15 February, in Stage Door Canteen. Invite you to join us, what I believe will be an insightful and powerful program that delves into the crucial role of African American soldiers in World War II and ultimately their legacy for our country afterwards. This program is free and open to the public. It'll also be available for online viewing. I'd ask that you please register. That helps. But more importantly, thank you for coming out here this evening. Hope to see you over there. Hope to see you at future conversations. But certainly, even though she thought she had the last word, let's give a round of applause to Dr. Debórah Dwork. Thank you very much.